Good morning. First of all, a big thanks to DLD and particularly Steffi for putting fighting climate change prominently on the agenda of this great conference. Tackling climate change in turbulent political times, who better qualified to discuss these challenges than L.Tubiana, eminent diplomat, eminent economist and climate policy expert, and in a sense the architect of the historic Paris Agreement. I might add, she is also the incoming new chair, a new CEO of the European Climate Foundation, which I chair, succeeding Johannes Meyer, who has done a tremendous job over the last 6 years in building the European Climate Foundation to the leading force in the non-for-profit foundation world on climate policy in Europe. The two revolutions of pervasive change that will impact societies, industries in very fundamental ways in coming decades that are underway is one, of course, the technological and digital revolution, the subject of the discussions here these days. But the second one is the transition to a low-carbon future economy and a society. And this second revolution is picking up speed. Picking up speed because government, in order to achieve climate objectives, have put together policies, have put in place strategies, have set regulatory regimes that will steer that fundamental pervasive transition. From 1990s to today, we witnessed the rise in climate laws and climate regulation and policies, strong policies, globally, going from 50 to 850 today. But the historic breakthrough was Paris. And Laurence, my first question to you would be, how come that after a very frustrating experience, Copenhagen, decades of disappointing results, Paris was made such a success? How did this happen? How did you do that? And what are some of the lessons?
I'll try to explain briefly, but again, thank you, Steffi, to have invited me, and to Caio is sharing with you who you are entrepreneurs, you are innovators, and normally these big agreements among governments are not really your main interest. But I'll try to explain why finally is very important and why you will be one of the forces implementing it in reality. I saw the program of DLD this year, and the question is, do we have a plan? And of course, to get the agreement in Paris, we need a plan. And the plan finally was very simple. Of course, it's very difficult to have 195 countries agreeing on something terribly difficult, which is to decide to phase down and to phase out, finally, fossil fuels in the economy, where you have had 2 centuries doing it, using it as a driver of the economy. So something really frightening for all governments. That's why it was so difficult before to agree on anything really serious. So the plan was, we have to create optimism and converging expectation from many to give the government the courage to agree finally, because they realize their own societies, their own countries were at risk with climate change. So the first thing was, and the scientific community of course helped, the plan was, yes, the menace, the risk is very high for you, not globally only, but for you, in your country, in your region. The second was to aim high, and to not only to aim high, being France and sort of the country leading the negotiation, but aiming high and looking at everyone saying, you should not be frightened. We can change the system deeply if we are doing this all together. And the plan was, in a way, to shape expectation. You know, when you are launching an innovation, you have to, in a way, anticipate that everyone would buy that or will believe that this will happen. So the plan was to create a self-fulfilling prophecy for governments that this will happen, that we will have an agreement, it will be ambitious, and we will be doing all together. And that's what, of course, the diplomatic type of work. But more importantly, it was to gather not only the government, but the cities, the business, the civil society, converging on one big objective, one big target, to aim high all together. And this worked, because government were afraid, but because the businesses were making the case, because civil society was encouraging and not only criticizing, because the cities were saying, anyway, we'll do it anyway, then they get more courageous to sign on. So the Plan of Paris was finally a very decentralized exercise of cooperative action to get innovation everywhere. So that's, in very, very broad terms, how we get there.
Now, one can argue that it's still too little too late, that the commitments made in Paris, if you add them up, don't keep us below the 2 degrees Celsius global warming. So very importantly built into the process, and maybe you could talk a bit about that, is how you ramp up, how you scale up ambition, and how you do that in coming years. There's no question that many elements are falling into place in terms of, for example, the tipping point of the logic of renewable energy, where the huge cost reduction makes this economically also very potent. We talked at this conference about mobility transition. Perhaps there's another tipping point also for carbon-free transport, cities coming that way. But we need this disruptive change and these tipping points in order to reach the 2 degrees. Let's not forget, 30% of oil reserves have to remain in the ground, 50% of gas reserves, and 80% of coal reserves presently known should remain in the ground. So how do you ramp up the ambition of Paris? What lies ahead? Is it too little, too late?
It's, of course, it's too little, but it's not too late. So the idea was really to embed in the agreement the sense of dynamics, the sense of dynamism. The first try of the government is too low. That's what the climate plan they put forward for having Paris sign on. But we built in a mechanism to revise every 5 years and to say we are not doing enough and it's too slow. And of course, all the philosophy of the Paris Agreement is to get a sense of responsibility, a sort of a meeting point where everyone's saying what we have achieved, and again, this sense of it's not enough, so we have to accelerate. And why we can accelerate? Because the good news can happen. We knew, for example, that, India is now delivering its renewable energy plan much, much faster than what they announced. They announced something lower because they were afraid not to implement it. Now, finally, the reality is going faster. The same for China, even if the Chinese problems of pollution are huge and really very difficult to overcome. So this trying to build in this optimism, this capacity of finally reality would get faster because expectation would give the sense of direction. Nevertheless, we should not forget the people who are left on the side. The resistance, and we'll see that probably in the end of our discussion, we have to remember that this is a tremendous development model change. And people, the coal miners, the people who are working in the fossil fuel industry naturally feel afraid. Countries feel afraid. People feel afraid. So we have really to give not only the sense of direction, but the capacity to see how you transform your job, how you find other jobs elsewhere. We can't just focus on the new, the modernity, the innovation. We have to think of the people who are left aside and offer solution and think about solution. And I think we have heard this morning many, many sort of good ideas to do so.
Now, how we bring the private sector in and how we ramp up finance, climate finance, was another big topic. There is, of course, public finance for mitigating and adjusting to climate change in the developing world, the famous $100 billion promised already at the Cancun conference, COP. But more interestingly, to my mind, is the private finance that can be mobilized. private finance by leveraging up private finance through limited amounts of public finance. And this has also a very strong political dimension, Laurence, because of the expectations of the developing world, who did not create the problem, but now for mitigating and adjusting need that money. So maybe first deal with the public finance side and how you see that ambition increased in coming years. What are the vehicles?
Maybe before responding to you on that, just to signal that Paris Agreement was possible because a number of businesses, the private sector, was anticipating that the sense of history was in clean energy, was in really clean transport, and that the fossil fuel economy was something of the past. Without that, we would not have any agreement in Paris. So that's why, in a way, again in Paris, the idea is that we ask everyone to regularly say, what are you doing? Are you accountable? What are you doing for climate? And that the target of Paris is not only the target for government, it's for everyone. You should think about what are you doing to implement Paris Agreement, meaning to lower the emissions, to really get out this fossil fuel economy. So that's a common sense of responsibility. Based on that, the idea was how we reorient, how we do the financial community responding to that challenge. And of course, the bankers, insurance, the institutional investors were quite careful about, is this not too risky? Why we should finance this new economy when we normally have reasonable returns with the traditional one? So that's the total change of mindset of, again, expectations. So that's why the public finance is key, because you have, in a way, to de-risk this new and to give the new frontier of finance a hope. And that's why our job on the Paris system was how we get the public financial flows, helping the private sector to come in, reducing risk for the front runners. And it is working. Now the financial institutions, the multilateral ones and the bilateral institutions are now not only just providing aid, but really trying to share risk with the private sector. And of course, you have been hearing these days that preparing for G20, Mark Carney, the governors of the Bank of England, has proposed new regulation, new instrument to get the private sector more sort of conscious about the risk to be trapped in fossil fuel. Again, the whole message is this one. You should electrify all the power sector, and we have clean electricity by 2050 in most countries. Who will finance that? It's trillions of investments. So we need the public finance to come in, and it's coming in a way, helping the developing countries in particular just to borrow at cheap prices, because the public funding will help to do that.
In the New Climate Economy Commission, where I'm a commissioner, we come up with an estimate of 90 trillion of dollars in infrastructure investments that are required in the next 15 years globally, and which should be made sustainable. The Chinese got that message with their bank and others. A huge opportunity for the next 50 years, because these investments will last, infrastructure will last 50 years, to have that pervasive change that we talked about. From my experience in the World Bank, one particular source are the multilateral development banks. They have huge balance sheets. They have instruments then to leverage up private finance through their balance sheets. I believe World Bank and others can do a better job than they're doing now in leveraging these public resources, because fiscal budgets are limited, and I think we cannot expect much more than these 100 billion from there. Laurence touched on private finance. I see as the two sides of the coin, one, the enormous opportunity now with repricing climate risk properly, the whole issue of stranded assets, to redirect, as you say, enormous amounts, trillions eventually, of financial flows, capital flows, in sustainable directions. And Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, who headed the task force on the voluntary disclosure of risk on corporate balance sheets, I think are here on the right path. This report is now being picked up, principles for balance sheet disclosure of carbon risk by the G20 under German leadership. We are fighting, also the European Climate Foundation, for this to become, say, over the next 6 years, mandatory for all corporates, not just voluntary. And I think there might be a platform, a learning platform put in place in the meantime to gain experience, because it should not be static. It should be dynamic climate risk analysis in what you disclose in corporate balance sheets. So that's on the risk side. On the opportunity side, of course, there are all kinds of new instruments, green bonds, to mention one example, that in imaginative ways innovate to mobilize these resources. In Davos, tomorrow or Friday, a new initiative by the Alibaba Ant Group from China and the UNEP inquiry of green finance we put in place on how to use a green digital revolution for mobilizing these kinds of resources. So I believe much of the answer is indeed in the finance sector, and I believe banks and the whole financial community has the means to mobilize to their profit and to avoid risk and stranded assets. Now, coming to the risks, the political risks in political turbulent times, Laurence, do you want to comment on what we see, maybe come to China also, to see in the US happening? To have an EPA appointee who is an opponent of EPA regulation in the past, to have Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State, where Exxon has, in our experience, been the most reluctant international oil company when it comes to acknowledging and dealing with climate change. The European oil majors have, after all, come out, for example, for carbon pricing already at the Paris conference. How do you assess and what can be done to mitigate that, I believe, huge risk? That it will cost us time. It will not stop this transition, but it might slow us down, and you're saying we might be too late as a result.
My feeling is that whatever the new administration decided to do in US, this agreement, anyway, it's not an agreement only, it's a wave, it's a movement. So I don't think the train has left the station already. So whatever the ones who are looking to the past, to the 19th century economy, wants to do, I don't think they will win, because that's just the reality, the markets, the innovation, everyone is looking in the other direction. So I think the best thing, the more important thing, is just to turn our back to fear, and just to say, anyway, we will do it. And that was what happened in Marrakesh in the Conference of the Parties on Climate that we have every year. That happens when the mayors met in Mexico 1 month ago, or in December, and say, anyway, we will do it. I think Michael Bloomberg says that very quickly. Anyway, whatever happened, we'll do it. The governor of California said, whatever the Washington does, I will do it in California. And in a way, we have to respond to that question. Do we do it ourselves? Are we doing something in that direction? And I think this issue, if we are accountable of this global goal we agree, all over the planet we agree on, we will make it. We may be delayed a little bit, but we will make it. So I think that everything depends on our courage and our intelligence and our collective intelligence. And that's not just abiding by sort of irrationality, fear, nationalism. It's not a fatality. It happens in history, but it's not a fatality. That's a moment of truth for all of us. I want to see how grateful I am for the German society to have reacted for the refugees as you have reacted. It's beautiful. You should do the same for all the targets we have to come to accomplish. So yes, we have somebody in Washington very soon that doesn't consider values as we are considering it. But That's not fatality. Let's fight. It's a fight. It's a fight for change. It's a fight for innovation. We have to give courage to each other. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's a big shift. But what are we doing? So I'm just confident for that. The only point I repeat, we have to look for the ones who are supporting this wave of negativity because they don't have a place to be in the future. So we have to apply, you have to apply your enormous intelligence to say, it's not only the best ones, the highest mind, the front runners, we have to look back to other ones. What do we do that implies that we have inducing change for others, and have we prepared something for them? That's our new frontier, and that's your new frontier, because you are changing the economy very deeply. So I'm optimistic with condition. We have to put pressure, we have to sign petition, but we have to act on the ground. And if I may, I want to introduce this role of innovation in all this Paris phase and how we get there, and particularly how we launch together with Bill Gates this mission innovation. You have been this breakthrough coalition building it. I was desperate of having innovation in the Paris sort of domain discussion, because I knew that for government it was really frightening how you can say to Modi or to the Brazilian Dilma Rousseff at that time, that she can change or he can change the economy so deeply and provide electricity for everyone at the same time, just facing down coal. You need innovation. Just to be confident, you just can't do it. So I was desperate in doing that. And then I met Bill Gates. We came in Paris to know what he could do for Paris. And I said, can we organize a mobilization for innovation? And then we launched this mission innovation, meaning that 28 funders, venture capitalists, and more than 20 countries would really join forces in the Breakthrough Coalition Mission Innovation to go to clean energy. And I have a question for you. So it was really, and I can tell you an anecdote, very, very nice one. I organized a meeting between François Hollande and Bill Gates and Modi. And it was a very diplomatic thing at the beginning, Modi talking to Hollande, and of course, a traditional discussion between two head of states, how you sell the planes. We have always planes to sell from the French side. You know, we have always your army and etc. And Modi was bored. It was just like, yeah, well, the conversation was sort of normal, but quite boring. And then I introduced Bill Gates to the room, and then I saw the smile of Prime Minister Modi. And just he's a very good communicator, as you know. And then he took the hand of François Hollande, and then the hand of Bill Gates, and then he just said, with victory. And he really felt that because of this coalition between governments and innovators, we could do that. And that when we won India's support to the Paris process, exactly at that precise moment. So innovators can make this happen. So my question to you is, are you doing something for climate? Are you in your job doing something? Will you do something? Can we say that by 2018, in DLD on January, we can just set up the balance and say what progress we have made, what innovation you are bringing to the table on the emission reduction, on adaptation? Please do that. We need it.
Raise your hands. Who does?
So let's have this meeting where DLD is delivering this result to the planet. We need that.
Maybe one or two elaborate on what you are doing on climate. You raised your hand.
Hi, my name is Hyneman. I'm an entrepreneur and investor myself since 7 years now. And I'm also thinking about climate a lot since a year or 1.5 years, I'd say. I really like that we had even more climate topics last year at DLD, but I'm very thankful that we have this talk today. And I just founded a new company, which is a digital freight forwarder called Freight Hub. And we're basically making the transportation of the way goods are transported more efficient. In the end, 50 to 70% of the transport is basically air and no goods. So we are improving CO2 a little bit by making transportation more efficient. But my question is actually, so the question is, how much can we rely basically on government and on official institutions versus individual change? So basically on the personal level versus governmental level. Because I don't really believe in government, if I'm honest. I'm 30 years old now, and government just didn't do very much for me until today, I guess. Or not too much, I don't feel that much. So my approach is basically to do it myself. But my big question is how to do it. And what's the most effective way? How can I, as a person, as one individual, save or have the most effective way of saving CO2, reducing my personal CO2 footprint? For example, I live in Berlin. I came with the ICE instead of flying Lufthansa because I thought it's saving CO2. Then other people tell me, yeah, you know what? Keeping up the infrastructure for the Deutsche Bahn is actually just creating as much CO2 as if you take the plane. So my question for you would be, and I don't know if it's possible to answer that, but what would your top 3 topics be, how each and every individual here in the room can basically improve their CO2 footprint? What's the most effective way? I mean, this goes through every single part of life. Food, do you eat local or do you buy the steak from Argentina? What energy source are you using? Are you driving your car all the day or are you driving a bike, and so on? Some things are clear. I drive my bike to work, for example, instead of car. But food is also more or less clear. Transportation, I find difficult.
Yeah. You asked your question. Laurence, you want to briefly?
There is not one silver bullet. So, but what we need is globally we need to have a plan, not of course a centralized plan, but a vision where we have to go. That's why every country has to do the plan by 2050, and I think Germany has done the first try to know what are the big sectors where the change is totally a priority, and then to go down on how everyone and in your own behavior or scaling up your own behavior because you need some kind of infrastructure or collective organization to really fulfill but we need the vision. If not, we never can respond to, is it better to invest in Deutsche Bahn infrastructure if, of course, it will create CO2 in the beginning, but it may, of course, be a very good bet for the longer term. So you need the vision. And you need not only the vision in the office of a government, but you need a vision at regional level, at land level here, and because civil society has to participate to that elaboration. And then that gives a guide. We need guidance. But then we need innovation from everyone. So I can't tell you that, of course, transport is certainly in this country a major, major priority as, of course, phasing out coal in the production of electricity. You have 2 priorities and, of course, a number of ideas to get there. But we need the vision of the society of the future that is fossil-free. And that has to be shared with everyone. And then it's much easier to know what to do in a personal way on meat consumption, as well as transport, as well as the way you are housing.
You have time for one more question? Yes.
Madame Tubiana, I want to address warmest regards of Felix Finkbeiner. He's the founder of Plant for the Planet. And as you might know, Plant for the Planet has been founded 10 years ago. It's the biggest forestation project worldwide based on pupils' work. So children sort of decarbonize by planting trees all over the world. In the meantime, I think 15.5 billion trees have been planted through this initiative on 5 continents. And there are some elderly people like me. I have little children too, and we want to kind of help youngsters.
What's your question?
Well, the question is, does the crowd know Plant for the Planet as an association which really decarbonizes on a very fundamental basis?
That's just a very good idea. I think forests, of course, are playing a big role. And I must say that digital apps have been helping a lot to just monitor what the forest is going and how it is preserved or not. So I think it would be a very good field of development. And of course, it may seem very far, the digital world to the forest and the nature, but in reality it's not. And for farming and for monitoring forest, I think it's a very big thing. So,
let me just, one final thought. I think we have to demonstrate also to Trump America that better growth is better climate, and there is no contradiction. In the report, there is no contradiction, and America better understand that because the Chinese have understood that. So if you reprice risk, if you have the technology, you have civil society, better growth becomes better climate, and better climate becomes better growth. And I hope we can all work along those lines. And I hope, Steffi, you leave that subject on the agenda of your fantastic conference also in coming years. Thank you very much, Laurence.
Okay, I promise. I will be back just to monitor if we have made progress together.
For the European Climate Foundation.